I was trying to think of something to record because I've been ill and also I've just been really fucking lazy. But then I remembered Smile is a film. Now, don't crucify me, but I don't actually remember much about the first film, mainly because I never watched it and I could just watch it now, but I really don't want to. I love horror films as much as the next guy, but I genuinely become such a pussy with uncanny jump scares, and the majority of Smile is about uncanny jump scares. But I do remember watching in massive fuck off quotation marks, by the way, Smile 2 in the cinema with the missus. I say watching, like my eyes weren't still tight anytime the audio went a bit too quiet or the vibes were a little bit off. But luckily, Smile has the same premise in both films, so the premise is actually pretty easy to explain. The premise being that the protagonist witnesses a suicide and the evil Smile entity torments the protagonist by showing them increasingly disturbing and terrifying audiovisual hallucinations until their mental barriers are completely torn down and they can't differentiate between reality and hallucination. If I had to compare the Smile entity to anything from cultural mythology, it'd have to be and I'm gonna butcher this name, so I'm very sorry, but a Pishacha. I don't know, this guy. He's from Hindu mythology. Now, I ain't saying that they're the same demon. In fact, the director, Parker Finn, said that the Smile entity is completely original. But what I am saying is that they're pretty bloody similar. They both possess people and are associated with making humans go insane, and they both prey on the vulnerable. The main difference is that this guy is genuinely a far more indiscriminate evil spirit, as a form of insanity they can bring can range anywhere from disease to moral corruption, whereas the Smile entity almost needs a ritual to feel satisfied, as the curse usually lasts between 3 to 7 days. During this time, the audio-visual hallucinations become increasingly worse before it eventually clutch you off in front of a witness by framing your death as a suicide, and then the curse passes on to that witness. It has a need to completely fuck up your perception of reality before it kills you, and that's the bit I want you to remember for the rest of the video, because that need for a slow, personal, one-on-one ritual is its greatest strength, but also happens to be its biggest weakness the second you put this thing anywhere near the fog. Now, I'm making this comparison between these two because this guy simply doesn't care and would thrive in the fog because it would spread as much hate as it possibly could whilst possessing people, whereas the Smile entity is like a picky 4-year-old in comparison, as it needs to slowly break one person down before moving on to the next. And in the grand scheme of things, the entity is a much more terrifying entity than both of them combined. Now, there are many reasons on why the Smile entity would hate being in DVD, and I think the biggest reason is that it would immediately realize that it ain't even all that, because in DVD there are essentially 3 different levels of eldritch horror. At the very tippy top, you got the entity, this incomprehensible cosmic god that's existed for far too bloody long and has spent an eternity farming suffering from literally any universe imaginable. He even decided to cart off tricks and feed off of the sadness of killers and 10-year anniversary. Below that, you got creatures like the Dredge. Now, it ain't confirmed if the Dredge is some type of baby entity, but the majority of the community believes it is, and I can't lie, yeah, but they're really bloody similar, innit? Both are otherworldly beings that feed on negative emotions, and both exist in ways where if any intelligent being tried to understand it, they'd probably go insane. No fifth-faffing about with some 3 to 7 day ritual to get the proper effect and to feel satisfied. They both just completely annihilate any sort of human comprehension. The difference between the entity and the Dredge is that the entity has a purpose. Sure, you could argue that the Dredge also has a purpose too, but if I said, all I do all day is bully people to make myself feel like a bad man, eat all day so I got my 15 minutes up on fat families, and then hop onto Reddit and rule my kingdom over on a subreddit, then I'll probably be told I have no purpose. Whereas the entity created the trials and manipulated everything that happens inside of it, so both killers and survivors serve it. The Dredge don't have that much control within itself and its influence. In fact, its power compared to the entity is probably less than 1% because it couldn't care less, as Dredge views killers, survivors, babies and even animals as basically the same thing. If it can consume you, it will. The best example being everyone's beloved Maurice, the clown's three-eyed horse. Poor bastard weren't even a proper part of the trials, and Dredge still decided to eat him. We can see this from his lobby animation and Dredge's memory of Maurice cosmetic. The same goes for Victor and probably Chucky. The theory being that if Dredge catches one of them lacking, it'd eat them with absolutely zero hesitation because they're small enough to consume. So putting myself in the Smile Entity's shoes, right? If I'm the Smile Entity, pulling up to the cut, thinking I'm the baddest bitch there, he's about to do some Hannibal type psychological torture on everyone and their mum, and the first thing I see is a next up sentient pound of darkness eating everything with a pulse, and I look up and I see some giant spidery creature with legs. I'm just saying, I'll be mad humbled, innit? I'll then crawl my overly happy self to where the other killers in the fog are, and I'm telling you mate, the first thing I'm thinking is fuck. Because little did I realise that unlike most horror universes, the killers here actually know and interact with each other. In one corner, I see one of the most iconic characters in horror scrapping with some weird, uncanny looking human creature that keeps repeating. In the other corner, I see some juiced up crackhead who's bouncing off the blood cart walls before running straight at me, trying to inject me with some weird orange glowing substance, whilst every other killer is chasing after him because he made them extremely deformed with his souped up heroin. I decide to ignore it, but my turn, and who comes up next to me? That's right, a deranged doctor who is cutting himself open and sticking electrodes in his brain for fun or sign. Out of curiousness, I ask what he does to the survivors, and he responds with, "Oh yeah mate, I electrocute survivors until they start seeing hallucinations of me." You what? Alright, okay, I'll stop laughing as the Smile Entity now. But if the Smile Entity was whacked straight into the trials, what would happen? I'm sure every survivor has some form of trauma from before being taken into the fog, except the instances of trauma was extreme in both Smile and Smile 2, that I ain't sure if the survivors went through anything remotely similar. So for this killer to work, let's say the entity grants them with the memories that will induce extreme trauma, borderline PTSD, like every time they escaped when their teammates died or every singular death in the trials. The entity has also buffed the Smile curse to work within the time frame of an average match instead of 3 to 7 days. The match plays out, the survivors die or escape, and all is fine and dandy until the Smile Entity realizes that when the trials restart, all of their memories are wiped, and that becomes a little bit of a problem. There's also the problem with hooking survivors too instead of killing them by its own hand. The majority of successful trials end in 12 hooking the survivors, so once the Smile Entity has hooked someone 3 times, it can't spread to that person because they're dead. All of their fear has already been fed to the entity instead of it, and that's gotta feel bad. Since its entire existence is being a parasite, and parasites need to constantly move to living host to survive. The other problem is that other killers kill just to kill, or because they're being manipulated by the entity. But as we already established, the Smile Entity, this psychological parasite, has a ritual. It enjoys spreading from person to person and slow torture, making someone not being able to distinguish reality from fiction, to where when it inevitably realizes how the trials work, it would probably just give up because it fundamentally wouldn't work. In the ending of Smile 2, the Smile Entity would have infected a large portion, maybe even the biggest portion of people it's ever infected in the history of its existence. So it would soon be waves of people inevitably dying, and suicide rates would skyrocket. So much so that there would be very few people in a couple of years. So its mastermind plan of taking over the world would be ripped away from it, and it would be forced to essentially chase a goal it can never succeed. The survivors are technically immortal under the entity's power, the downside of having their memories wiped. Something I truly believe the Smile Entity would fucking hate the entity for, because it brought it to a place where the Smile curse cannot spread. So yeah, that's why I think the Smile Entity would just hate being in Dead by Daylight. You have one extremely large cosmic entity that rules over everything, a smaller, more stupid entity that can't think beyond anything other than consumption, and then you have you and just a bunch of pissed off and angry killers, and also the survivors will just forget. So the Smile Entity will just eventually die off because it wouldn't be able to survive. But yeah, anyway, that's it. Cheers, thanks for watching.